All right, welcome everyone. My name is Paul Connecton. I am the CMO here at Beeswax, and I'm excited to welcome you all to the second in our series about the cookie apocalypse. Firstly, I hope everyone is staying safe, social distancing, keeping healthy, and we hope to be able to educate you guys with some information on the future of digital identity and some of the concrete solutions that you can you can adopt to get over this challenge. So just a few little things with housekeeping. First of all, we will save plenty of time for Q&A at the end. You'll see the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen there. You can also raise your hand. We love live questions, and we will prioritize live questions if you'd like to grill Ari at the end about anything about ad tech or specifically about the future of digital identity. All attendees to this webinar will receive an email with a link to download a white paper version that will contain a lot of the solutions that Ari will talk about now, and lay that out in significant detail, as well as some insight as to how Beeswax is handling this challenge. So I will now turn it over to Ari Paparo. I'll give you a little background on him for those who don't know. He's my boss here at Beeswax. He's the founder and CEO, formerly of Google and AppNexus. He builds ad tech products. He tweets a lot. You can follow him at AriPap. And I will turn it over to him. Thank you, Ari, and teach us about the future of digital identity.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the intro, Paul. Thanks for everyone coming. We have over 200 participants, which is great. And hopefully the content will be useful and something that will be worth your time. So by way of the agenda, I'm going to give sort of an introduction about the state of identity in digital media with some data and some in-depth look at different kinds of identity. And then I'm going to flip it and look at use cases and say, how can we use different forms of identity? So this is the second in a series. So the first webinar that I gave about 6 weeks ago was in the immediate aftermath of Google Chrome's announcement about cookies. And that was really a overview of what we knew at the time, what was going on at the time. And it was sort of reactionary to that news. This is going to be a little bit more of a broad strokes overview about what is available from a tools perspective and what we can do about it. I'm not going to cover the Chrome sandbox proposals or anything along those lines. I'm going to be focusing more on identity and what we can do about it right now. So let's start by motivating the conversation and talking about the use of identity in different kinds of media. And going way back and saying, well, how does traditional media use identity? And, you know, in broad strokes, you can say that traditional media was broken out between high reach and low identity resolution media. So, and the opposite. So if you look at TV and print and radio, traditionally all of those were purchased based on average cohorts of audience, not individuals. You can say that this program reached a certain amount of 18 to 30 or 35-year-old males. And then you would measure it based on aggregated data, effectively from panels like Nielsen or cohorts of data. And you might even be able to attribute the results of your advertising through cohort level techniques like geographic impact of ads or surveys of respondents. And one of the key aspects of the traditional media was that waste was accepted and implied. If you were buying a sort of a TRP in TV on certain demographics, you assume that some amount of people outside of that demographics would be exposed to the ad, and that was considered waste. And then on the other hand, you had very high reach, high resolution identity-based marketing, traditional direct response marketing. Where you were buying one-to-one deliverability, you were sending mail to individuals who were very well understood through various data techniques. But the problem with that has always been the lack of sight, sound, and motion, the lack of sexiness, the limited applicability of branding. So that's kind of to set the stage on the world of media prior to digital. And then what happened in the first, say, 10 years of digital advertising was there was this dream of one-to-one at scale, combining the best of both of those media. So the oft-touted goal of digital media was the right ad to the right person at the right time. It's a cliche. I'm bringing it up here because it kind of defines the most optimistic parts of what digital media was supposed to do. But if you dive a level deeper and you say, what does it mean to have right ad, right person, right time? And each of these aspects of the goal requires identity. To have the right ad, you need to know someone's personal preferences. To have the right person, you need to know that person's demographics and psychographics. And to have it at the right time, well, you need to know intent. And so in broad strokes, you have to say, well, identity has been the core to the digital dream. And I would motivate this conversation by saying that the current erosion of identity resolution is kind of the defining trend for the future of digital advertising. If we're saying, well, what's it going to look like 10 years from now? Identity is the key question. That's the pivot. Are we going to have identity? Are we going to have cohorts? Are we going to have identity only owned by certain large companies, or is it going to be something broader? Will we be using non-deterministic techniques? Those are all the questions that will define the future. All right, so with that very big picture conversation, I want to go now into detail. The rest of the deck is much more detailed and tactical. And there's a lot of words on the deck, and I'm not going to read them all because we're sending a PDF as a follow-up, but I kind of want to cover some of this. So first of all, identity, the state of identity varies quite a bit by channel, media channel. The type of ads that are being purchased has a lot to do with the resolution level of identity. So to give an example, web browser. So right now, the estimates are that around 60% of web browsing has third-party cookies enabled, roughly equal to the Chrome market share. But in the future, as we know, the third-party cookies are going away entirely. So the medium of web browser is in a perilous state and getting worse. In-app is in a great state right now. In-app ads have great identity resolution because of maids, but they're going to be restricted by Apple and Google. I think all the smart money says in the next couple of years, there will be a significant pullback in the ability to read and write these maids, and that will change the way in-app is measured. Connected TV. Connected TV is the hottest area of digital advertising right now, growing like crazy, sight, sound, and motion, etc. But right now, the state of identity in connected TV is really messy and inconsistent. I have some data on the next slide about this. And so that's a big challenge as we start investing in connected TV. How will we be able to measure it? And then for the sake of completeness, I've included two parts of digital that we don't always talk about in the same conversation: digital out of home and podcasts. Well, digital out of home is by design a cohort-based medium. No one expects the ability to identify individual users who are exposed to a billboard or a digital ad, and that's not likely to change. And in podcasts, we have a similar situation for different reasons, where because of the nature of the sort of asynchronous download of the podcasts and the gatekeepers of Apple, Spotify, et cetera, you're unlikely to get any sort of individualized data anytime soon. So when you look at, from a marketer's point of view, the portfolio of digital buying, it's very challenging from the identity perspective, even before Chrome made its recent announcement. After Chrome announcement and after in-app potential announcements, it's going to get that much harder. So here's some data I thought was interesting, just to pick off one topic here. I asked our analysts at Beeswax to look at all of the auctions we were seeing over the last quarter for connected TV and say what kind of IDs were present in those auctions. And very surprisingly, the vast majority of the IDs in connected TV are what we call synthesized IDs from the SSPs or the exchanges. What that means is, unlike in mobile devices where you have a device ID made that's very persistent, in the connected TV environment, the middlemen, the exchanges, are doing their best to identify these users based on whatever information they have. So an SSP ID might be a hash of an IP address and some other information. And it's persistent only with respect to either that SSP, meaning you can't use it across SSPs, or even less so within that SSP and their publisher partner. So it's interesting that in this very emerging area, we have a pretty limited set of IDs. Another data point that I asked the analysts to pull that I thought was interesting was IP addresses. So we're going to talk a lot about IP addresses in this conversation. It's almost a taboo subject. A lot of people don't want to talk about it because it has sort of an uncertain regulatory and privacy control aspect. But I decided to pull the data to look at it, and about 2/3 of IP addresses that we see on auction requests are complete, meaning they're all 4 octets for IPv4, whereas about 1/3 are truncated, meaning the final octet is limited. A truncated IP is very much less useful for identifying users, but more privacy compliant. So which way is this going to head? Are we going to be in a world where IP becomes less useful or more useful? Unclear, but it's an interesting data point that I hadn't seen published previously. Okay, so what I'm now going to do is do a sort of lightning round where I'm going to walk through all the forms of identity that are currently out there in the marketplace and give sort of a quick review of where they are, what they're good for, what they're not good for. And then we're going to use this data in the second half of the presentation to talk about practical techniques and technology that can be used by advertisers and publishers to take advantage. So from the top, third-party cookies, everyone knows them, everyone loves them, they work well for great use cases, but they've always been very limited in that they're a device, not a person. A third-party cookie does not represent a human being. They represent a human being on a phone or on a laptop. And that's never changed. And now they're going away. So it's sort of moot to talk about third-party cookies because they're so great for ordinary ad tech use cases, but they're already in rapid decline. Mobile identifiers, similar situation to cookies. They're persistent over time for that device, not a person. Also very questionable, their future. Worth noting that opt-out of mobile identifiers is more challenging than cookies, and probably very few consumers know how to do it, even though it's possible on your phone. Then onward to some more interesting topics. So first-party cookies, sometimes called second-party data. This is becoming a battleground for identity where publishers are looking to use their first-party data to enable advertising techniques. They are persistent, they're not blocked. You can link them to their first-party profiles, so publishers can use all the data they know about you. But the fundamental challenge is that they're hard to use across sites. As soon as you take a first-party cookie and try to use it across sites, it becomes a third-party cookie. So that's really the rub, and where it gets kind of challenging to figure out what use cases they're good for and what use cases they're not. Shared cookies or shared identity. So I broke this into 2 categories. You have shared identity where multiple parties are using the same ID, and then shared login consortia where multiple, usually publishers, are sharing a login, and they're pretty different. So shared identity consortia were the hot thing a year or 2 ago, where people were talking about reducing cookie syncing and otherwise standardizing on a single ID. But this has kind of had a big setback because they were all still based on third-party cookies. They were just more efficient ways to use third-party cookies. So largely, when in the rest of this deck, when I talk about shared identity, it's going to be just an extension of third-party cookies with the same pros and cons. Whereas shared logins, which are in use in some markets, particularly Germany and some other European markets, allow publishers to share first-party data and to have a consistent advertising system across multiple sites and multiple properties. But it has the same problem with first-party cookies, which is how do you use it as an advertiser? How do you bridge it outside of the consortium? Moving on to other forms, so graphs. So graphs have been out there for probably almost a decade. This is not new information. There are probabilistic graphs, meaning use statistics to try to figure out the identity of the users, and deterministic graphs, where you use either the email or phone number or some other information that is deterministic about the user. And in both cases, they have pros and cons. They're useful for targeting, for example, or frequency capping, and we'll talk about that later. But in both cases, these graphs are still largely dependent on third-party cookies. So the probabilistic graph is taking an input of a bid request, like a third-party cookie, and then bridging it to other third-party cookies and maids and things like that. And so that's problematic if third-party cookies are going away. And then for deterministic graphs, even if you have someone's email, you have to bridge it to a bid request, and that bid request may only have a cookie. So once again, the graph only becomes useful if you link it to something that's persistent. So there's a lot of work going on right now where vendors of these graphs have to become future-proof. and there's some real questions around that. And then the last two, so IP addresses and fingerprinting. So I talked about IP addresses earlier. IP addresses are sort of the hidden secret of ad tech in that they're used pretty widely by companies looking to enhance their identity solutions. However, they have some questions around privacy. They're difficult to opt out of, among other problems. And in some jurisdictions, they're considered very personal data, whereas in others, it's an open question. One of the challenges with using IP addresses is they're not just not individuals, they're also not devices or individuals, they're households. So in a household with an internet router, everyone effectively has the same external IP address. In a business, everyone has the same IP address. So they're sort of, it's not that they're better or worse than cookies, they're different. They're measuring something different. Fingerprinting is here just for the sake of completeness. I think everyone acknowledges that fingerprinting is the most privacy unfriendly technique available, definitely cannot be opted out of, doesn't have consent. So I'm not going to talk about it further in this presentation, but I put it here for the sake of completeness. So that's a very whirlwind tour around all the forms of identity, and they're intermixed with each other. So deterministic graphs use third-party cookies, use first-party cookies, etc. But I wanted to kind of get out there with the definitions, so when we get to more practical use cases, we can talk about how they're used. So the second half of this presentation is about use cases. I know I'm going quite quickly, but I want to kind of cover a lot of ground here. So we've talked about the fact, what have we talked about so far? Identity is absolutely core to digital advertising, and it's under siege. Secondly, it already varies a lot by medium. Thirdly, there's a lot of different forms of identity, and there's a lot of pros and cons to each of them. This is a complex situation. So let's talk about how we can use the data and what the best practices are. So broadly speaking, you can use digital identity in 4 different techniques for advertising, and this sort of applies whether you're a bidder, DSP, SSP, exchange, whatever it is. So the 4 ways identity is used is frequency management, targeting, optimization, or user scoring, or anything like that, and lastly, attribution and reporting. You could quibble with these 4, but these are pretty broad swaths of how the identity is used. And if you were to pivot those 4 use cases against some of the forms of identity that we talked about in the first slide, you might find some patterns. So for example, if you look at third-party cookies, MAIDs, IP addresses, and sort of the shared identity consortia against these 4 use cases, when that identity is present, all of this works really well. So if we have a third-party cookie, you can do frequency capping, you can do targeting, you can do bidding, you can do attribution. Now there are caveats, as I talked about earlier, which is, third-party cookies are devices, not people. They're not great for, online to offline. There's a lot of problems with them, and they're going away. But the state we're in, and the reason why identity has been so core to digital, has been that a lot of these signals are quite useful. And then if you look at the other kinds of identity I went over earlier, they're very useful as well, but only within certain contexts. So first-party cookies, meaning publisher-side cookies, are really useful for frequency capping on the publisher site. They work great for that. They work better than cookies do to some extent, but they don't work across sites. I'm not going to read every single part of the slide, but it gives you the kind of idea. Probabilistic graphs are great for frequency capping and targeting, but they're really bad for attribution because people don't want to use a graph for attribution. That's not deterministic. You would over attribute. Deterministic graphs. So when you know exactly who this user is and it's linked to an email or a phone number, that's great all around, but it tends to be very limited reach. So if you're to use deterministic graphs for all your targeting, you would reach a lot fewer of those consumers because the graph naturally has limits to how much of the population it can cover. So let's go on to some of these use cases in depth. So frequency capping has always been sort of a best efforts type of technology. There's no ad serving system in history that's been perfect at frequency capping. Just the nature of the way and the speed with which decisions are made in a technology like ad serving or bidding makes it impossible to perfectly frequency cap. It's about to use the COVID example, flattening the curve. You don't want to have spikes of frequency. You want to be able to have an average frequency that's relatively controlled. And so when you think about the kinds of ways in which an ad serving or bidding system can use identity for frequency cap, there's a lot of tools at your disposal because it doesn't need to be perfect. So third-party cookies and device IDs, they work great, but they're per person, per device, not per person. The deterministic or probabilistic graphs are also a really important tool in frequency capping. They work across devices. Publisher tools and shared logins, as I said on the previous slide, can work per publisher basis. And when we looked at that graph on connected TV, that like 2/3 of all the auctions only had effectively a publisher ID, that gives you a sense of some of the limitations on what you can do there. And then IP addresses, which can allow household-based frequency, not users. So the key takeaway here is that no identity works perfectly for frequency cap, and platforms need to have some sort of fallbacks between methods or some sort of hybrids between methods to do the best to flatten the curve and to make sure you don't over cap or under cap against the users. So let me give an example. So this could be, a very common example of what your ad tech stack could be seeing in the marketplace. So imagine the request one comes in and it has the DSP's cookie present. So let's say it's beeswax. So we have the DSP cookie, great. Then a second request comes in and the DSP cookie is not present, but it has the same IP address as that first request. Should we serve an ad or not? Should we frequency cap or not in that case? The IP is not as reliable as the cookie because it could be a household, it could be a business, or maybe that's what we want. I don't know, it depends. And then a third request comes in. It has a new DSP cookie, so it doesn't match the first request. But it has the same household ID as the first request based on a probabilistic graph that we've licensed. So the graph says request 1 and request 3 are the same household. Should we cap it or not? And if we cap it, are we going to be charged a fee by the graph provider or not? And will we pass that through to our customer or not? These are interesting questions, and it is surprisingly complicated. So my advice, if you think about a takeaway, is these are conversations you should have with your vendors if you're a marketer or an agency. What are they doing? How does this work? How do you control frequency in this complex world with mixed identity? Because there's not one answer. I'm not saying that one vendor is correct, that beeswax is better than so-and-so, or DV360 is better than so-and-so, but it's the sort of question that can make a big difference actually in your reach and delivery. Second topic, targeting. By targeting, I'm talking about first-party data retargeting and third-party data that are dependent on identity. Obviously, contextual targeting still works, is not dependent on identity, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about identity. Targeting is very affected by the reduction in identity because so much of it is based on third-party cookies and nades currently. The data exchange world, the retargeting data, all that is very dependent on those sort of legacy identity forms. So when you talk about targeting, the graphs are very useful. So both probabilistic and deterministic graphs are very useful for targeting when the IDs can be linked properly. It's pretty common in most DSPs that if you have a well-known user and they match on a graph, you want to extend the targeting to include them. You may want to pay less because of the probability, or you may not. It depends. But these techniques are dependent on those graphs continuing to work if third-party cookies go away. So it's up to the vendors you work with to continue to invest to make sure their graphs continue to be effective. First-party cookies are particularly well-defined for targeting use cases. And we're talking, when we say first-party cookie, I'm really talking about publisher-side cookies, which sometimes people call second-party cookies. I know it gets super confusing. But what I'm talking about here is when a publisher knows who the user is or something about them, enabling the buyer to use that data for targeting. And that seems like an area where we have a lot of independent vendors who are investing in this area, a lot of press releases going out. It's actually good for publishers. Publishers will get more power and be able to monetize better with better data. And there's a lot to it. I'll go on the next slide in a little more detail. And lastly, my favorite topic, IP address. IP address works pretty well at the household level for targeting. It is not very widely used by data exchanges. I don't believe any of the major data exchanges will provide IP address based data for privacy reasons, but it is used quite a bit. And you may see this. So if you've ever seen an ad that was retargeted to a product your spouse has been viewing, that's because of IP address. Basically, some retargeter saw that the IP address was looking at some product, and then you saw, and then they retargeted based on that because the cookies weren't reliable. And that's probably what's going on. Okay, so let's talk about the publisher first or second party use case, because this is sort of a hot topic in the industry right now. So going from left to right, you have a publisher, and the publisher has a first party cookie. And because it's on their domain, that is largely unaffected by browsers. I know there's some 7-day limits, all that, forget about that. So publisher has great content about the user. They have a first party cookie, which may be anonymous or may be tied to a login if the user is logged in. And if it's logged in, they can then extend it with all kinds of other data. So this first party cookie has a lot of valuable data associated with it. And then in addition, the publisher may create profiles based on the user's behavior on the site. So a user visits the automotive page of a newspaper site 5 or 6 times, suddenly they're an auto intender. That data is then passed through the value chain of programmatic to the exchange and then to the DSP. And that could be passed using segment IDs or deal IDs. And suddenly you have targeting at the DSP level for first party data without any of the restrictions of third party data. This is definitely happening right now, and is a big area for investment. But there's real questions here. How do you trust the publisher? You know, if it's up to the publisher, they're going to say every single user of theirs is a young male is interested in buying a car. Should DSPs treat the publisher's self-declared data? What's the role of vendors and DMPs in this chain? Are they going to verify or audit in some way that a given piece of data is accurate or meets some sort of standard the IAB might set out? Those are open questions. Another more technical issue is that currently most DSPs, or maybe even all DSPs, are relying on deal IDs to transact in this flow, and that's really not optimal. You really want segments of some kind to be used, and that's a technical detail that is out there in the market that, to my knowledge, no DSP is ingesting segments natively from publishers. They're only using deal IDs. So the last topic in this presentation, and then we'll go to Q&A, is attribution. So attribution is probably the area that is most negatively affected by the lack of identity. And you could argue that attribution has never really worked right in digital because of the historic dependence on cookies and on last click. So we went from last click, legacy attribution, which were cookie based and pretty much garbage, to an environment where we don't even have garbage. We got nothing. So basically, the challenge of attribution is separating causation and correlation. And by the way, I did a very in-depth webinar on this a couple months ago on our YouTube channel that I'd recommend watching. And how do you do this? How do you figure out whether a user actually bought something or was affected by your ad when you don't know who they are or you have challenges of attribution? So third-party cookies, MAIDs, you know, that's still the fundamental way this works. It's going away. Probabilistic graphs were never really used for attribution because they're probabilistic, so they probably over attribute. And with attribution, you want it to be conservative. You want to know exactly what works. Deterministic graphs, that has a really good opportunity here, where if an ID can be linked from the exposed to the transacted, and you have something like an email address that's persistent, that's going to be really accurate. And it's not going to cover anywhere near 100% of your media buys, so you're going to need some statistical technique to extrapolate. First-party cookies are kind of useless for this. Publisher cookies aren't going to help you with attribution at all. And then IP address, same problems as in all the other slides. They work at a household level. doesn't account for people, it's households. And this gets pretty complicated because, like, if you, let's say, use, and this goes for some of the other techniques also, let's say you use maids for mobile, but then you use IP addresses for household, and then someone takes their phone and goes to work, and you guys remember going to work years ago? We used to go to work. Well, let's say I take my phone and I go to work, and then I have a different IP address because I'm on work Wi-Fi, and then I see the ad. You're going to need models that take both of those into consideration. So the takeaway is this is really challenging, and there is not one obvious solution here. Buyers, advertisers are going to need to get pretty creative around attribution and have real strategy here. So this is a totally theoretical media plan from the future, not real data. But what would happen if in the future you look at your media delivery as you try to figure out attribution, and you have, let's say, 29% of your delivery was against a deterministic graph. And you can talk to that vendor, the vendor that provided the graph, and do real attribution on that 29%. But then the rest was a mixture of, let's say, programmatic guaranteed with no IDs, and contextual ads, contextually targeted ads also with no IDs. So the majority of your delivery had no IDs. And you're going to have some sort of, data science magic to figure out what the ROI was on this campaign. That's very challenging. And so I think attribution is going to be very messy moving forward. I think that one thing to consider is whether less digital techniques might be appropriate. For example, zip code holdouts is or postal code holdouts is an old time technique from direct response where you just don't advertise in certain zip codes and see what the delta was on your purchases from that zip code versus others. Same with time-based blackouts, just turn off all your ads for a week every couple months, see what happens. Those would be kind of the more directional ways of looking at this. But attribution is a real challenge. So let's sum it up. So, and please put your questions in the Q&A. I'm very happy to answer questions. Identity is disappearing, it's dissipating, it's not disappearing. And it's really putting everything we know about digital media in jeopardy. This varies by media type, it varies by technique, it varies in all different ways. The world's not getting simpler, it's getting more complicated. There are lots of forms of identity and none solve all the marketer use cases. Like deterministic is seen by some as a silver bullet that we're going to get people's emails, and I'm involved in the project Rearc from the IAB, and it's great. And if we get someone's email and can use it, God bless, but it's never going to be 100% of your media plan. So what else are you going to use? How are you going to round that out? So what I think, and the big advice here, is that you need to choose your tech platforms based on flexibility, intelligence, and the ability to deal with different use cases. Because every marketer is different, every technique is different, and one size doesn't fit all. What works for one marketer may not work for the other at all, depending on their media mix, their goals, their techniques. So that's kind of my soapbox around this. So I hope that was useful. We're going to be sending out a PDF of this document, and we're also going to be putting this video on YouTube. With that, I'm going to give it to Paul to start going through the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ari. That was great. And please do submit your questions. We will answer them in the order that they were received. And if anyone wants to raise their hand and ask a live question, I'll break the rule and put you to the top of the line. But let's just get started. So this is the first question. It seems to me that when we talk about first-party options, we totally miss the most important drawback, scale. It's unrealistic to consider a first-party solution to third-party because opt-in is dramatically smaller than opt-out. Don't we have to explore more broadly about how to bridge the loss of scale, such as machine learning?
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, I think I addressed this question whenever I talked about deterministic techniques, and that's what I'm using as sort of the same thing you're talking about. I talked about the problem of scale, and I brought this up on the last slide that, in a typical media plan, you might get 20 or 30% of your media to be deterministic. Can you use machine learning? Maybe. I know that Google is a good example here, where Google has started using machine learning to do attribution in mobile installs in places where they don't have the data available. And that's interesting. And the challenge with that is, how do you trust it? How do you know that the machine is not over or under attributing, especially when you're grading your own homework? So I think machine learning absolutely has a role here. It's very hard to tell what it'll be, though.
All right, moving right along. Hi, Ari. Great webinar. Thank you. If a buyer is using DV360 or Amazon's DSP, will they be able to do frequency capping, targeting, et cetera, based on the Google or Amazon identity?
Yeah, okay, really good question. So this is very open-ended, this question. I'll answer it a couple ways. So first of all, when Google announced the Chrome cookie deprecation, a wide misunderstanding was that because they had first-party cookies, this wouldn't affect them. But in fact, the Google first-party cookie is still third-party with respect to the sites on which it serves ads. So Google doesn't have a natural advantage because they have a first-party cookie. They could if they take further steps to enhance it, which I can talk about in a second, but they start on a level playing field with everybody else here. So on a third-party site, the DoubleClick cookie, the Google cookie will not work for frequency cap. It doesn't on Safari currently. Now, what they're doing about that is a couple of things. One is they are using machine learning. So Google announced already that DV360 is using machine learning to simulate frequency capping on sites where they don't have it. Unclear if that works, but once again, frequency capping doesn't need to be perfect, so good enough. Second thing they could do would be more aggressive, would be if Google can push their login on more and more publisher sites. You can imagine a world where Google says, hey, you're using GAM, DFP, you're using DFP to monetize. If you also get users to log in using Google, your CPMs will go up, right? And that would be pretty aggressive. And I don't believe that's part of the conversation they're using right now.
All right, moving down the line, regarding first-party cookie, what will be the verification layer between former third-party segments and first-party cookies? For example, golf.com calls a left-handed golfer segment as someone who has done X engagements, whereas the buyer, aka the money, says a left-handed golfer is a user who has done Y. Is there an opportunity for DSPs to play the verification layer?
Left-handed golfer is always the example everyone uses. I don't know who invented that. I think it might have been Dakota or Dave Morgan. Okay, left-handed golfer. Yeah, no, that's the exact point I was making on that slide, which is how does a buyer verify that the publisher-controlled segmentation is what they want? And there are a couple of options. One is you trust the vendor. So the DMP on the publisher side has some standards and you trust them. That's iffy. Two is there's standards published by the IAB. Like you need to be on 3 pages or more within 20 minutes in order to, be in the category. Also kind of questionable. Third is some sort of audit, like some independent party investigates the way publishers certify they're in a segment. Maybe, I don't know. So those are kind of some of the ideas. I mean, I guess there's another idea, which is the publisher could just blast everything they know about the user to the buyer and let the buyer decide. But that kind of gets, first of all, it's very wasteful. Secondly, it would potentially violate the privacy of the user. So that's a hard problem, but it's an opportunity. And I think that's why so many entrepreneurs are investing in first-party data right now.
Interesting. Aside from user_ID, what fields in the bid stream will likely be affected by these changes? Should we currently expect the last octet to go away completely? What about geodata and user agent?
Okay, I charge a couple $100 an hour for these detailed answers.
We promised everybody you would answer all their questions.
Yeah. I think that the way Beeswax is handling it, which is I think is sort of the way a lot of DSPs are handling it, is that we're checking on consent, either GDPR or CCPA, and if the user doesn't have consent, we're truncating IPs, eliminating user agents, hashing or removing personal data. And if we do have consent, they're being passed through. And that's kind of the most like business positive, but legally tenuous decision. I don't see that necessarily changing. If the enforcement or if there's different guidance on the privacy laws, you would start to expect some of that stuff to be more aggressively truncated. For example, most SSPs outside of AdX don't currently truncate that last IP. I don't think they will unless someone forces them to. As to the question of which fields are less available, I think user agent is likely to go away. It's just a lot of data that's good for fingerprinting and good for some of the less privacy safe techniques. So that's probably one that would be on the chopping block.
All right, next question. Whenever I ask data partners about how they are planning for when cookies become obsolete, they all resort to how they're leveraging LiveRamp, which is a great partner of ours. But by the way, just a little aside, is
Yeah.
this enough for data partners to survive when cookies become obsolete? What other questions should I be asking to make sure my data partners are cookie proofing for the future?
Yeah, data partners have a real challenge here, right? So the data ecosystem has hundreds, thousands of vendors, hundreds of thousands of segments, and the whole ecosystem is based on third-party cookies and maids currently. And the adding a friction point where it needs to be translated to say LiveRamp, and then LiveRamp needs to have deterministic data to survive the lack of cookies, will absolutely reduce the economics of the data partners and reduce the availability of data. There's just no way it will survive in this current form. So I think that the only thing you could do as a data partner to make your data more viable is to have it tied to the same or similar first-party data that is used by the DSPs or the graph providers. So if currently you're providing data that's cookie synced with LiveRamp and then LiveRamp monetizes, that's a fairly tenuous connection and will be declining. If on the other hand, your source of data is tied to an email address and that email address is persistent and can be hashed and combined in a way that will not be as affected by third-party cookies, then it's more likely to survive.
Okay, I'm going to take a question from the chat. If you all could submit questions via the Q&A feature, that enables me to see them more in a stream, but let's hop over there. Could Google use hundreds/thousands of first-party cookies for each publisher, since people log into Chrome, and link them together to simulate third-party cookies?
Yeah, so a couple of points here. This is a complex question. So first of all, first-party cookies that are available to Google through Google Analytics are first-party and cannot be used across sites. So just because Google Analytics has views into a first-party cookie does not mean that they are available across sites as third-party cookies by definition. Now, how do you stitch them together? There's 3 ways Google could do this. Number one is they could use their knowledge of who the user is at the browser level, Chrome logins, to do that. I firmly believe they will not do that for privacy reasons. It would be cheating, basically, and I do not believe they're going to do that. Option 2, which I mentioned earlier, is that Google could push the login with Google capability to sites, and when the user logs in with an email address, they could tie the email address to the first-party cookie and effectively have a third-party identity. That is very possible. They may do that because it's more consumer-friendly. They're opting into it, et cetera, et cetera. And then the third possibility, and this is what's happening with, I think, a lot of other vendors in the space, the independent vendors, is they could use some sort of machine learning magic to try to identify that the first-party cookies are the same individual across sites. The problem with all those techniques, and this is what's being done by many independent vendors, is ultimately it seems to boil down to some form of fingerprinting. Like if you have an ID that's a first-party cookie on news site 1 and news site 2, how do you know they're the same user? The only way to do it is with some other data point to stitch it, and that data point is likely to not have been consented. It's likely to be an IP address or something like that. And I think Google would be too cautious to do that.
All right, next one. Is contextual classification a viable method for trust/verification of publisher cookies used for publisher segmentation, at least in part, or can multiple methods be used for this?
So I think publisher data is likely to be a mix of contextual and demographic and psychographic. And so what I mean by that is if a publisher can say, hey, this is a user who's a male 18 to 35, and context is an input there, but it's not going to be very reliable. Or a publisher could say this person's an auto intender, in which case context is everything. So you could imagine auditing a publisher's segments based on a list of URLs and a frequency of URL that were visited, and that being done by a third party, and maybe that is viable, but it wouldn't work as well for demographics.
All right. How will list-based PII matching be affected? Will this be possible only with deterministic partners and possibly IP?
So by this, I think what we're talking about is like clean room matching. So the advertiser has a list of users, the publisher has a list of users, and we're going to target them somehow. You definitely, need an intermediary to do this, because the whole point of protecting the privacy is not passing this data between parties so it can be used. There's a trust issue. I think that there are, I would say, two approaches in the market. There's the LiveRamp approach, who once again, as Paul said, is a partner of ours, where they have a graph. And so the buyer and the seller are taking lists and sort of they're like leaves on the graph and then matching. I think that's one approach, although, you know, the Achilles heel to that approach is whether the graph itself has consent and is privacy safe. And the second approach broadly is where there's no graph. You have the IDs go into a clean room and have some sort of algorithm match them and then push out to each of the parties their own IDs that have matched. And there's a vendor or two doing this in Europe. And that seems to be a little more privacy compliant, although the reach would be much less because you'd end up with just the point-to-point matches as opposed to having the whole tree of matches to begin with.
Okay, next question. Actually, it's an argument. You ready for an argument?
Between two panelists are arguing?
I guess
Is one of them Paul Gubbins?
No, I won't reveal names. I would argue, this person's saying, that the solutions you've listed are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Vendors like ID5 and probably many others are combining first-party cookies, deterministic and probabilistic graph methodologies involving IP address for graphing purposes to build a new ID solution. What is your perspective on this, Ari Paparo?
Did Matthew ask that question, or is it Scott Menzer?
I can't reveal the sources. But
okay. Yeah. So I think I said, if I didn't say, I meant to say that the forms of identity in my list are absolutely not mutually exclusive and are overlapping in many ways. To give an example, not about ID5, but like to give a general example, like the probabilistic graph is a graph of first and third party IDs. That's what it is. It's a list of first and third party IDs and how they relate to each other. I sort of overly flattened the list of solutions in order to bring contrast to them. As for a vendor like ID5, I don't want to talk about them specifically, but I'll say that that, you know, adding together different techniques, probabilistic, deterministic, coalitions, etc., is a great way to get defensibility. And in the same way, my main point here, which was, I'll go back a slide. What was my main point? Which was, one size does not fit all. That was my main point, right? That goes for vendors as well. So if you're an ID provider, you shouldn't put all your money in cookies. That would be dumb. You have to use a variety of techniques. And as the purchaser of a vendor's offering, you should be asking those kind of questions.
all right. Well, hopefully it wasn't too argumentative. All right, we have a question about link decoration now, which is interesting to me. How long do you think attribution by link decoration is going to live? I know it's already limited. Now that's like UTM source equals, all that kind of nice stuff you decorate links with.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, link decoration is interesting. So link decoration UTM equals is currently continues to work on Safari for click-based attribution. This is how Google and Facebook can attribute conversions on Safari. However, Apple released a restriction on this that sort of slapped Facebook's hand, because Facebook was passing like complete IDs in the link decoration so that they could profile the users based on Safari. And so Apple did some magic that further reduced the ability to use link decoration. So there's a clear evidence that Apple doesn't like link decoration. And then you add to this the fact that Google's first proposal in the Chromium sandbox was for click-based attribution. Now, if you scratch your head and say, wait, click-based attribution still works on Google with UTM, are they planning that the sandbox will be the only way that you'll have differential privacy on click-based attribution as well? And so that raised my eyebrows and made me think that Google Chrome might also be thinking about getting rid of link decoration as part of its cookie apocalypse. So that was a very long answer to say I have no idea.
All right, this question from a brand, it would seem, based on the wording. Thank you, Ari. When should I be concerned about cookies going away? 6 months, 2 years? Will my ability to target using cookies suddenly disappear one morning? How should I prepare brands?
Yeah, good question. First of all, now, the 40% of the audience on the web is non-identifiable by cookies, and unless you have a strategy for that, you're missing out on the most valuable, wealthy, urban consumers who all use iPhones. So the answer is not even now. It's a year ago is when you should have started thinking about getting rid of cookies. Now, I like to think about this time period. So Google announced 2 years. So we're 1 month into this 2-year limbo period. And what's going to happen during these 2 years is sort of like, it's a little unclear, but you would expect there to be events that will happen that will raise the temperature on this problem. The first event is like, it could be Chrome announcing a case study of, hey, we were able to track X, Y, and Z using the sandbox. Or we're partnering with the 4As to test the sandbox or something like that. We haven't seen anything. There's been no news at all in the last 6 or 8 weeks. So as soon we don't have an indication is how serious Google is on what time frame. And when we start getting those signals, I think we'll have a little more impetus to talk to our customers and say, like, hey, this is really happening. But with that said, I think that the time is now to be definitely experimenting, but even investing in alternative solutions that can produce better visibility into attribution right now, or better ability to target right now.
And that dovetails into the next question, which I swear was not asked by anyone who works at Beeswax. But so what is Beeswax's solution for these challenges? What investments are you making to solve it?
Yeah, so I don't want this to be a Beeswax commercial, and the PDF we're sending around, the white paper, is a little more Beeswax centric. So I'd encourage you to read that if you're a customer. But I will say we've done a couple of things. We're investing pretty heavily in our partnership with LiveRamp. So we were the first and only DSP to now enable IDL bidding on connected TV, and a press release went out about that a month ago. We also have invested pretty heavily on some of these flexibility options. So this idea of fallbacks where we try cookies. If cookies don't work, use IP addresses, use publisher provided IDs. That's a big area of our investment. And some of that's available in production right now. And I'd encourage you, if you're a customer, to ask your account rep about it.
All right, moving right along. If you were a publisher with a normal/small amount of logins, let's say 5 to 15% of all traffic, what would you do for an identity strategy? Wait for Google, join the 1PD ID systems. I don't know what that is. Maybe you can decode that for me. Or stick your head in the sand.
Well, stick your head in the sand is definitely not a good idea. I think that you don't really need to be dependent on the login solution in order to encourage logins. I think if you go to first principles, how are publishers going to benefit, or how are they going to reduce the harm from the loss of identity? And the answer is 2 things. Either you have contextually valuable inventory, meaning you're writing about things that people want to advertise about, like, you know, automotive reviews or whatever it is, right? And that may be feasible or maybe not for your business. Or you are giving people reasons to give you their identity. And that means benefits to logging in, less ads for logging in, less interruptive, interstitials for logging in, or other things. And so when you're thinking about strategies to get people to log in more, that's orthogonal to whether you use Google's login or not. Like, that could be a secondary question. But you should be thinking hard about how you build that relationship with the readers.
Okay, we have 5 minutes left, and we have 16 unanswered questions. So we are entering what I like to call the lightning round. I wish I had like a siren or something, but we're not that sophisticated here. So quick answers. What do you see as the primary challenges for supply-side consortiums that potentially share identity and/or first-party signals?
Yeah, so supply-side consortiums are great when they're in a defined market, either a vertical or a geography. So in Germany, a lot of the publishers are combining because the German market is sort of insular, where the same buyers and sellers interact. You could do the same thing for a vertical, like health or auto or something. If it's broad, then it doesn't have as much value for the consumer. The likelihood of a consumer going across the sites in the consortium are lower, so it's less valuable.
Okay, what of programmatic retargeting?
What?
What about programmatic retargeting? What's the state of that?
Yeah, I think I talked about this a bit. Retargeting is difficult because you can't use cookies, or you won't be able to use cookies. So using deterministic data like email or phone would be your ideal. If you don't have that stuff, using IP address, and then after that, you're shit out of luck.
Yeah. If attribution becomes significantly delayed to collect holdout responses or use statistical inference, how do you think performance can be optimized? Is all optimization going to be based on clicks and assumed to work similarly for view-through?
Yeah, so there's two different options. One would be to use clicks. That has huge problems with it because clicks are anti-correlated with quality. The other is to use occasional deep dive studies to, like holdouts or A/B tests in such a way that you get an instinct for what works and doesn't, but you're not going to be able to optimize live.
Okay, here's one I haven't heard before. Is local storage under the same limitations / restrictions to third-party cookies? Aware it is restricted to 7 days under Safari, ITP, and specific to publisher domain.
It seems like the person who asked that question knows more about it than I do. Yeah, I would just assume it's going to have the same restrictions as cookies, except in the case where it's not as restricted, you'll have more flexibility because of bigger storage size.
Okay. Do you think the eventual end result, post-cookie removal, will drive more power to the walled gardens or no change versus today?
I think it will. I think that there's a flight to safety. If the world's complicated and you don't really care, you can give all your money to Google and Facebook and call it a day. I think that's the wrong decision for most major marketers and agencies. And I'd like to see a little more independence in thinking that way. So we'll have to see.
Okay, where do you see publishers' first-party audience data fitting into buying strategies moving forward as cookies continue to decline? Are there any parameters in a publisher's pre-bid request and exchange that might help better inform bidding decisions?
Well, I think I talked about this a little bit about how publishers can use their first-party data. In terms of, I think it is a challenge on how advertisers or marketers will be able to forecast and media plan against that data. It's an interesting question. I never really thought about it. Maybe that's a new business opportunity, the cross-publisher media planning tool, or maybe it's just going back to ComScore.
All right, we have time for one more question. So okay. Again, I'm going for ones we haven't heard or don't really touch on anything you spoke of. Broad question for pontification. With attribution ebbing, how will this impact the affiliate model?
Well, affiliate's largely last click, so I think affiliate could be okay as long as they're as long as the providers support UTM and otherwise are on top of doing that sort of thing. So I think affiliate should probably be okay.
Okay, well, with that, we will wrap up the Q&A. For those who did not get their questions answered, we are saving these questions, and we'll have someone reach out to you with some kind of answer, if it's not already covered in the materials that we'll be sending to you guys, including the white paper that you'll get and a recording of this webinar. So I just want to thank everyone who joined. I want to thank Ari. I want to thank all you for giving us your time. I know there's a lot of Zooms happening, there's a lot of webinars, but overall, we think these are great opportunities to get educated on how we're dealing with this challenge of digital identity. So I hope you're all staying safe. I hope you're social distancing. And thank you. This will not be the last in our series about the cookie apocalypse. And so stay tuned.
Thanks, everybody.